Margaret Johnson's house sat quietly on the corner lot of Mapledale, a peaceful residential neighborhood in Chicago. With its white exterior walls and blue-gray roof tiles, and a small but well-maintained front yard where a single old oak tree stood, it wasn't luxurious compared to the neighboring houses, but it was a symbol of the steady life she had built up to this day. Margaret worked as a sales manager at Greenfield Pharmaceuticals, leaving home at 7 in the morning on weekdays and returning around 8 in the evening. Her colleagues sometimes called her the Iron Lady, not out of cruelty, but because of her ability to handle even the most difficult negotiations with composure. She had earned the deep trust of her clients, and her sales performance last year had topped the department. "Ms. Johnson is always perfect," was the general assessment within the company. However, behind that perfect exterior, she carried deep sorrow. 5 years ago, her daughter Emily had died of leukemia. Emily, who was 8 years old at the time, had been everything to Margaret. A bright, curious little girl who talked about wanting to become a doctor someday. The year from when the illness was discovered until her death had been the most painful period of Margaret's life. After Emily's death, Margaret divorced her ex-husband Brian. Neither had intended to blame the other, but in their grief over losing their daughter, their relationship had become irreparably broken. Brian had said, "If you had taken her to the hospital sooner," while Margaret thought to herself, "If you had been home more often." In the end, both understood that neither was really blaming the other, but rather themselves, yet being together only deepened their wounds. After the divorce, Margaret threw herself into work. She worked from early morning until late at night, and spent weekends on paperwork and client visits. Her colleagues didn't know much about her private life. Occasionally, someone would ask, "Do you have children?" But Margaret would only answer, "I used to," and would say nothing more. On weekend afternoons, Margaret had one routine she never missed: visiting Emily's grave at Greenhill Cemetery. She always brought white calla lilies and spent quiet time in front of the small headstone. Sometimes she would play classical music, which had been Emily's favorite, through a small speaker while talking to her daughter in her heart, "Emily, Mommy worked hard again today." The regret of not being able to stay with her until the end still weighed heavily on Margaret's heart. Emily had died while she was away on an important business trip to the West Coast. She had rushed back after receiving the call from the hospital, but her daughter had already passed away peacefully. She was waiting for Mommy, Brian had said, but Margaret couldn't forgive herself. Today, she had just returned from a 3-day business trip to Seattle. When she opened the front door, she could see several envelopes stuffed into the mailbox. There was an electric bill, a credit card statement, and one thick envelope she didn't recognize. The sender was listed as Cook County District Court. Probably just another mistake, Margaret thought lightly as she picked up the envelope. It might be a jury duty summons or perhaps some tax-related procedure. She took off her coat while opening the envelope, and the moment she looked at the document inside, her heart began pounding violently. "You are charged with acts of violence against your daughter." Margaret was speechless. She nearly dropped the papers but caught them frantically, reading the same sentence over and over again. But it was impossible. Her daughter Emily had died of illness 5 years ago. The next morning, Monday, Margaret woke up 30 minutes earlier than usual. She had barely slept the night before, reading and rereading the court documents. Her reflection in the mirror was pale, with dark circles clearly visible under her eyes. However, she followed her familiar morning routine and got dressed. A navy blue suit with a white blouse, and a modest pearl necklace. No matter how disturbed her heart was, keeping her appearance perfect was a survival skill she had developed over the years. The headquarters of Greenfield Pharmaceuticals was a modern 25-story building located in downtown Chicago. Margaret's office was on the 18th floor, with a beautiful view of Lake Michigan from the window. Usually, she would start her day by making coffee and enjoying that view, but this morning she just sat down facing the pile of documents. "Good morning, Miss Johnson." Sarah Davis entered the office with a cheerful greeting. 28-year-old Sarah was an excellent sales representative whom Margaret had welcomed as a newcomer 3 years ago. With her natural brightness and persistence, she had grown to handle several important clients. "Good morning, Sarah." Margaret tried to sound normal, but there was an awkward quality to her voice. Sarah sensitively picked up on the change. "Haven't you been tired lately? Did you rest well over the weekend?" "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you." Margaret smiled, but her smile looked more artificial than usual. "Shall we check today's schedule?" 3 meetings continued through the morning: a sales strategy meeting for new drugs, a quarterly performance review, and a discussion about contract renewal with major clients. Margaret provided her usual accurate analysis and proposals, but deep in her heart, she couldn't stop thinking about last night's documents. The words, "acts of violence against your daughter," kept flickering through her mind even during the meetings. When lunch break came, Margaret returned to her office and closed the door. With slightly trembling hands, she dialed the phone number of the law firm she had noted down the night before. "Harrison and Associates Law Office. This is Margaret Johnson. I received charges from the court last night, and I'd like to request a consultation. Please hold for a moment." While the hold music played, Margaret felt her palms sweating. Since Emily's death, she had tried to avoid any involvement with legal matters. Even the divorce proceedings, she had kept to minimal involvement. "Thank you for waiting. Attorney James Harrison will speak with you." A low, calm male voice came through the phone. "Ms. Johnson, what kind of charges are involved?" Margaret explained with a trembling voice. "I'm being charged with acts of violence against my daughter, but this is a mistake. My daughter died of leukemia 5 years ago." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the phone. "That is an extremely unusual situation. Could you bring the charges to me so we can meet as soon as possible? Are you free this afternoon?" "Yes, I'll make time." "Then please come at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Since the charges appear to be genuine, this needs to be taken seriously." After hanging up, Margaret's hands were shaking so much she couldn't lift her call.
Can you imagine making $10,000 a month just from YouTube, all from home? That's exactly what I did with Reddit Stories. No face, no voice. Check the link in the description if you're curious.
Coffee cup. The cup made noise on the desk, spilling some of its contents. She hurriedly wiped it up with tissues while telling herself, "It's okay, it must be some kind of mistake." At 1 in the afternoon, Margaret told Sarah she was leaving early. Something urgent came up. "Could you prepare the materials for tomorrow's meeting?" "Of course. But are you really okay? You look very pale." Sarah's eyes showed concern. "Thank you for worrying about me. But I'm fine," Margaret answered while putting on her coat. "Call my cell phone if anything comes up." Harrison and Associates Law Office was located in a historic building on Chicago's legal district. When she opened the heavy wooden door, a calm reception area spread out before her. The receptionist guided her politely, and Margaret was soon shown into Attorney James Harrison's office. Harrison was a gentle-looking man with neatly arranged gray hair, wearing a deep blue suit. Law books were arranged orderly on his desk, and various certificates were displayed on the walls. "Ms. Johnson, I understand you're in great difficulty. First, may I see the charges?" Margaret handed over the documents she had brought. Harrison adjusted his glasses and began reading the document carefully. He occasionally frowned or shook his head while taking about 10 minutes to review the contents. "Ms. Johnson," Harrison placed the charges on his desk and looked at Margaret with a serious expression. "Could you tell me more about your daughter Emily? You mentioned she died of leukemia 5 years ago." Margaret answered with a tightening chest. "Emily died when she was 8 years old. She had a year-long battle with the disease. I didn't make it to her final moments. I was on a business trip." "That must have been a painful experience." Harrison's voice was filled with sympathy. "However, there's a problem. Looking at these charges, the accuser claims that abuse is currently ongoing. It states continuous violence and ongoing medical neglect. Margaret gasped. That's impossible. Emily isn't here anymore. That's the biggest mystery. Harrison pointed to a part of the charges. The accuser's name is listed as anonymous, but someone is definitely making this accusation intentionally. Moreover, the court has officially accepted this. Margaret leaned back in her chair. She felt dizzy, and reality seemed to be slipping away. Who on earth would do such a thing, and why? We need to find that out. Harrison leaned forward. This is clearly a false accusation, but legal proceedings have already begun. A preliminary hearing is scheduled for next Friday. By then, we need to gather as much information as possible. At dusk, Margaret returned home with heavy steps. When she opened the front door, the usual silence greeted her, but today that quiet felt oppressive. On the living room shelf were several photos of Emily, a 7th birthday photo where she was smiling in a pink dress, the last Christmas family photo, and the final photo of her smiling weakly in the hospital bed. Margaret picked up that photo and sat down on the sofa. Emily, who would do such a terrible thing, she whispered in her heart. Her daughter's innocent smile now caused her even more pain. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep again. Staring at the ceiling, she repeatedly asked herself, who, and why now? She desperately searched through 5 years of memories, trying to think of anyone who might have reason, but only Brian and his new wife Jessica came to mind. However, Brian couldn't possibly do such a thing. He too had been a father who loved Emily. Outside the window, Chicago's nightscape glowed quietly. The view that she would usually find beautiful tonight seemed only cold and heartless. Margaret pulled the blanket up to her shoulders and waited for dawn in anxiety and fear. 3 days later, when Margaret returned home from work, there was another thick envelope in the mailbox. This time, the words, Cook County District Court, seemed larger and more intimidating. Her heart began pounding violently again. Her hand shook as she tried to unlock the front door, and she couldn't get the key in the hole properly on the first try. Sitting down on the living room sofa, Margaret took a deep breath before opening the envelope. This time it was a formal court summons. She was ordered to appear in Cook County District Court, 3rd Courtroom, next Tuesday at 10 in the morning. Below that were detailed accusations listed. Defendant Margaret Johnson is charged with continuous psychological and physical abuse of her biological daughter Emily Johnson. Margaret felt her hands trembling as she held the papers and continued reading. The accusations were beyond imagination. The defendant locked her daughter in the basement every night after 9 p.m. and committed acts of violence. She provided only low-nutrition meals and intentionally prevented the child from receiving necessary medical care for growth. When the daughter sought help, she ignored her and also interfered with school attendance. None of these items matched anything Margaret remembered. She had loved Emily from the bottom of her heart, and after the illness was discovered, she had adjusted her work schedule to focus on nursing her daughter. She had cooked Emily's favorite meals, read to her, and always accompanied her to hospital treatments. Her only regret was not being there at the final moment. Turning further through the charges, she found several images labeled as evidence photos. However, these photos were clearly composites. They appeared to combine Emily's face with photos of another injured child's body taken somewhere else, crudely made. The seams in the photos were so unnatural that even an amateur could tell, and the lighting angles didn't match. How horrible, Margaret murmured aloud. To use photos of her deceased daughter to create such vile fabrications. A mixture of anger and sadness overwhelmed her, and tears streamed down her cheeks. She looked for the accuser's name, but again it was only listed as anonymous. However, at the bottom of the document, printed in small letters, were the court clerk's name, a processing number, and unexpected information, evidence submitted by Jessica Miller, Representative, Attorney Robert Smith. Jessica Miller. Margaret remembered that name. It was the name of Brian's current wife. The woman who had remarried Brian 2 years ago, whom Margaret had met only once at Emily's grave on the anniversary of her death. However, why Jessica was listed as the evidence submitter for an anonymous accusation was puzzling. She should have had no direct connection to Emily, since she had met Brian after Emily's death. Margaret picked up her cell phone with trembling hands and dialed Attorney Harrison's emergency contact number. Harrison speaking. This is Ms. Johnson. More papers arrived. A formal court summons and detailed accusations. Margaret's voice trembled with tears. Please bring them immediately. Tonight is fine if necessary. This is an emergency. An hour later, Margaret was back in Harrison's office. Despite the late evening hour on a weekday, Harrison had readily agreed to meet. His office was filled with the warm aroma of coffee, and the lamp on his desk cast soft light. Harrison read the charges carefully, occasionally sighing deeply. When he saw the attached photos, his expression became stern. This is clearly a false accusation. Harrison removed his glasses and wearily put his hand to his forehead. However, there's a problem. The court has officially accepted this, meaning legal proceedings are moving forward. But the evidence photos are obviously fake. Even an amateur can see their composite photos. That's correct. However, in court, we need to prove that. And most importantly, Harrison pointed to a part of the document. Jessica Miller is listed as the evidence submitter. Your ex-husband's current wife. Margaret nodded. But Jessica met Brian after Emily died. Why would she? That might be the key. Harrison leaned forward. False accusations always have motives: financial gain, revenge, or to obtain some legal advantage. Ms. Johnson, do you know anything about your daughter's estate or inheritance? Margaret thought. There's a trust fund established in Emily's name. My parents set it up for her future. I believe it was about $5 million. When Emily died, there were complicated legal procedures regarding its management. That's it. Harrison's eyes sharpened. If you were convicted of child abuse, it could affect the inheritance rights to that trust fund. Especially if your ex-husband has remarried, that could represent significant financial benefit to his new spouse. Margaret was appalled. You mean, for money? Unfortunately, such cases aren't uncommon, Harrison continued with a serious expression. Especially when the victim is already deceased, they can't argue back. It's a calculated and malicious crime. But I can't believe Brian would be involved in something like this. He loved Emily too. Perhaps Brian doesn't know anything about it. It's possible his new wife is acting on her own. Harrison stood up and looked out the window. In any case, we must fight this. By next Tuesday, we need to prepare as much counter-evidence as possible. What should I do? Margaret's voice was despairing. First, we'll hire a private investigator. We need to look into Jessica Miller's background and motives. Then we'll gather evidence to refute the false accusations, Emily's medical records, school records, your work attendance records, and so on. Harrison sat back down and began taking notes. It will be expensive, but this is a battle for your life and honor. That night, Margaret spent another sleepless period. However, this time she felt not only despair but also anger. Having her beloved daughter's memory defiled and her love as a mother denied was an unbearable insult. Looking at Emily's photo on the bedside table, she made a vow in her heart. Emily, Mommy will definitely protect your honor and our love. I'll find out who's doing this and why. Outside the window, Chicago's city lights shone in the night sky. Margaret quietly steeled her resolve for the battle ahead. Through Attorney Harrison's introduction, Margaret met with private investigator Michael O'Connor. O'Connor was a former Chicago police detective, now in his early 50s, working independently in investigative services. His gray hair, deeply lined face, and sharp eyes told of years of experience. Ms. Johnson, this case is extremely malicious, O'Connor said while looking at a copy of the charges. Using a deceased daughter for false accusations. I've only seen this a few times in my 30-year career. How long will it take to get investigation results? Margaret asked anxiously. For basic background investigation on Jessica Miller, about a week. However, to uncover the motives behind these accusations and any accomplices might take a bit longer. The following Monday, the day before her scheduled court appearance, Margaret was at work as usual. She was trying to distract herself from anxiety by concentrating on work, but her focus was scattered. Sarah was concerned about her condition and spoke to her several times, but Margaret only answered, "I'm fine." Around 3 in the afternoon, O'Connor called. "Ms. Johnson, I have important information. Can we meet immediately?" Margaret hurriedly left work early and headed to O'Connor's office. The office in a room of an old downtown building was exactly like a private detective's office from the movies. Various newspaper articles and photos from cases were posted on the walls, and investigation materials were piled high on the desk. "Please sit down," O'Connor said with a serious expression. "Shocking facts have come to light." He opened a thick file and took out photos and documents. Jessica Miller, currently 28 years old. Real name, Jessica Ann Parker. She moved to Chicago 5 years ago, but there are problems with her previous background. O'Connor showed a photograph of young Jessica being handcuffed by police. She has an arrest record for fraud in Detroit. Investment fraud targeting the elderly. She received a suspended sentence, but the total damage was $2 million. Margaret gasped. "Does Brian know about this?" "Probably not. She used false names at times." O'Connor showed the next document. "And this is the most important discovery." It was a bank record. Jessica had $300,000 in debt before marriage. She also has a history of treatment for gambling addiction. However, after marrying Brian, her life changed completely. So her target was money from the beginning? Exactly. However, we also discovered there was a problem. O'Connor showed another document. Most of Brian's assets are still connected to the management of Emily's trust fund. Even though he remarried, Jessica has no direct inheritance rights. So by making me look like a criminal? Yes. If you were convicted of child abuse, it could affect the management rights of Emily's trust fund. Eventually, Brian could gain complete management rights, and that could potentially fall into Jessica's hands as marital property. Margaret leaned back in her chair. To target money by exploiting her daughter's death was unbelievably despicable. But there's more, O'Connor smiled thinly. Jessica isn't acting alone. He took out another photograph. It showed Jessica meeting secretly with an unknown man at a cafe, photographed from a distance. This man is Robert Smith, the attorney listed as representative on the charges. But he too is a problematic individual. What do you mean? Attorney Smith has received warnings from the Bar Association in the past. He's suspected of submitting false evidence and deceiving clients. He was on the verge of complete disbarment and currently has almost no work. O'Connor pointed to the secret meeting photo. This photo is from 3 weeks ago. That means they were planning this before the charges were filed. Margaret felt anger rising. Do you have evidence? Evidence that can prove their conspiracy? Actually, I obtained that too. O'Connor proudly opened the final file. While I can't bug Smith's law office, I can record conversations in public places. He took out a small recorder. Yesterday, I discovered them meeting again and successfully recorded it. What came from the recorder was a conversation between Jessica and Smith. If Margaret is convicted, what happens to the trust fund? It was Jessica's voice. If everything goes according to plan, your husband will gain complete management rights. That should work in your favor too, Smith's voice answered. But what if they find out the evidence is fake? Don't worry. The judge is busy. There's no time for detailed verification. Besides, the victim is already dead. No one can argue back. So I can get half of $5 million. That's right. Just don't forget my fee. The recording ended there. Margaret was speechless. Hearing voices planning to profit from her daughter's death was more painful than she had imagined. Is this sufficient evidence? Margaret asked in a trembling voice. More than sufficient, O'Connor answered with satisfaction. If we submit this recording and investigation materials at tomorrow's court hearing, the charges will be immediately dropped. And Jessica and Attorney Smith will be arrested for fraud. Margaret sighed deeply. Brian didn't know anything, did he? As far as the investigation shows, he was completely deceived. In fact, he could also be considered a victim, O'Connor said while organizing the materials. Betrayed by his wife, and even his deceased daughter's memory was defiled. That night, Margaret contacted Attorney Harrison and reported O'Connor's investigation results. Harrison said excitedly, "Excellent. We can achieve complete victory in tomorrow's courtroom. And this recording can also be used as evidence for criminal charges." Should I tell Brian in advance? Margaret asked hesitantly. I'll leave that decision to you. However, when the truth comes out in court tomorrow, he'll be greatly shocked. After hanging up, Margaret stood by the living room window, gazing at Chicago's nightscape. She picked up Emily's photo and spoke to her in her heart. Emily, Mommy found the truth. Tomorrow, I'll protect your honor. And I'll make sure those who used you receive their punishment. The next day, Cook County District Court's third courtroom was filled with tense atmosphere. Margaret sat at the defendant's table alongside Attorney Harrison, while the prosecutor and Attorney Smith sat across from them. Jessica sat in the front row of the gallery, occasionally glaring at Margaret. Brian was also in the gallery, but his expression was full of confusion. The judge entered and the hearing began. However, when Harrison submitted the investigation materials and recording tape as evidence, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed completely. When the recording was played, Jessica's face turned pale, and Attorney Smith frantically tried to stand up. But court security officers were already waiting near them. "This is a trap," Jessica shouted. "You're an unfit mother. You let your daughter die." Margaret quietly stood up, turned around, and looked at Jessica. Emily said, "I love Mommy until the very end. I loved my daughter with all my heart, and I still love her. Unlike you, who would exploit a dead child for money." The judge banged his gavel and ordered silence. Then he ordered the immediate dismissal of the charges and the arrest of Jessica Miller and Robert Smith on fraud charges. 3 months later, Jessica received a 5-year prison sentence for fraud and false accusation. Attorney Smith was disbarred and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Brian immediately began divorce proceedings with Jessica. After the court hearing, he bowed deeply to Margaret. "Margaret, I'm truly sorry for doubting you." Tears welled up in his eyes. Margaret smiled gently. "It's okay now, Brian. You were deceived too. I think Emily is at peace in heaven." On the day they visited Emily's grave at Greenhill Cemetery together, Margaret made a report in front of the small headstone. "Emily, Mommy was able to protect you. The people who tried to soil your name have been properly punished." While placing white calla lilies, Margaret told Brian of an important decision. "I've decided to donate Emily's entire trust fund to the Pediatric Cancer Research Foundation. I think Emily would be happy about that too." Brian nodded deeply. "I think that's best. If Emily's memory can be used to save someone else." That evening, Margaret left the cemetery alone. The setting sun illuminated the oak trees, casting gentle light on the headstones. As she walked, she thought to herself, "What is a real family? It's not just blood relations. It might be love, trust, and hearts that care for each other. Some people, like Jessica, use family relationships to hurt others, while others, like Sarah, care genuinely even though they're just workplace colleagues. The definition of family is probably broader than we think. The following Monday, Margaret came to work with a bright expression. After a night of good sleep for the first time in a long while, her face in the mirror had regained its vitality. "Good morning, Miss Johnson," Sarah called out cheerfully. "You look very energetic today." "Yes, thankfully," Margaret smiled from her heart. "A problem I'd been carrying for a long time has been resolved." From the office window, the beautiful view of Lake Michigan was visible as always. The morning sunlight illuminated the lake surface, announcing the beginning of a new day. Margaret made coffee while gazing at that view. Emily is no longer here. That fact hasn't changed. However, her love for her daughter will remain in her heart forever. And it was that love that gave her the strength to overcome this trial. Margaret Johnson began walking quietly toward a new morning, carrying the pain of the past but with hope for the future in her heart. While learning what true family means, she was about to open a new chapter in her life.